so early. Well, for those of us in California, so early. My name is Rinka Stahuljak. I'm professor of comparative literature and French and director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies here at UCLA. And it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies that is in its 58th year, having been founded in 1963. Now, we are 14 months into the pandemic and hurtling toward the end of the first full academic year conducted remotely. And I'm very proud to say that we've adapted well to the virtual environment, thanks to the superb staff of CMRS, whom I'd like to acknowledge today before you, Karen Burgess, my assistant director, Erin Romo, program coordinator, and Brett Lenderberger, our webmaster. A few words about us. CMRS promotes and sustains transdisciplinary studies of the period from late antiquity to the early modern era. And since 2019, it includes the spatial coverage of the globe beyond the traditional understanding of late antiquity, Middle Ages, and Renaissance. So we are formally making connections that are true to the time period, from Africa to the Pacific Rim to East and Southeast Asia. Embracing the globe, the center is promoting a relational model of research. As you may know, we adopted 5 research axes to structure the polyvalent and multifaceted inquiry of the center's diverse faculty. These axes are sustainability repurposing, fluidity permanence, bodies performance, conversion mobility, communication archive. You can find them on our website. This conference, organized by Sharon King, our CMRS associate, fits in the body's performance axis, which convenes scholarship that addresses issues of class, race, ethnicity, disability, and sexuality across pre- and early modern spaces. And questions of intersectionality were central to medieval and early modern identity and often explored precisely in theater, dance, and music. Now, truth be told, this wonderful conference idea of law and disorder could fit into most of our axes because medieval fools were always tilting the axis or bending the line, as it were. Entire communities are to this day social outcasts because they speak truth to the power. This conference asks an important question: can justice be spoken from the center? Is there such a thing as a just discourse except to be held from a minor position? And although this conference was postponed from last spring, this delay in retrospect seems felicitous and, for lack of better word, timely. Law and disorder, the theme of the conference, takes on a whole new tint and resonance after the social upheavals and calls for racial justice of the last 12 months. I wish to take this opportunity to proclaim that UCLA CMRS respectfully acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukwetam, Ahihirom, and Eyohimkem, past, present, and emerging. It is a pleasure to introduce the conference organizer, Sharon Diane King, who holds a PhD in comparative literature from UCLA, my home department. She pursues academic research in 2 main areas: medieval and Renaissance theater and performance with a focus on comedy, and fantasy, horror, and science fiction. Publications include the book City Tragedy on the Renaissance Stage in France, Spain, and England, and a number of essays and translations. As CMRS associate, she has organized and co-organized several academic conferences, including Recreations, Text and Performance, and the Comic Supernatural. For over 30 years, her medieval and Renaissance theatrical troupe, Les Enfants Sans Abri, has performed short plays from the 13th to the 17th centuries in her own translations and adaptations in the US and Europe. She and her husband, Kurt Steinler, have produced several short films, one of which, Plant Life, won an award for Best Mockumentary. So without further ado, I turn the virtual stage over to Sharon King.
Good morning. Welcome to Law and Disorder. Fools, Outlaws, and Justice in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Though I regret not being able to greet you all in person, I'm delighted that we reach a larger audience with this virtual forum. After my remarks, we will go right into the video of the Fool's Play, and then we'll go into the first paper. There will be time to discuss the video tomorrow after the second screening. Oops. The conceit of justice, howsoever mercurial its fortunes, is tied to concepts of fairness and equity, usually, though not always, codified into law. Law and justice found rich expression both in lived experience and narrative in the Middle Ages and early modern periods in Europe. We see this expression in the codes of civil and canon law that emerged from 11th century Bologna at the newly created university, in Siete Partidas, created within the 13th century court of Spanish King Alfonso el Sabio, in depictions of Saint Louis of France, hearing his subjects' cases as he wields the iconic hand of justice itself, symbol of the justice dispensing power of God placed in the royal hand. One thinks of King John compelled to sign the Magna Carta, Chaucer's efficient, rhetoric-laden man of law, and myriad images of Dame Justice with and without her blindfold. But law and justice then and now are not without their untidy, troublesome discontents. Thus, the focus of this conference is the confrontation of law, upright behavior, in theory, and justice with their seeming opposites, transgression, disorder, and folly in myriad guises. The liminal characters known as fools, both natural and professional, also have a full and diverse presence across these centuries. Fools were generally known for wearing the mantle of outsider and rule breaker. They were derided for revealing humanity's foibles, yet welcomed for speaking wisdom in the guise of nonsense. A most cursory survey needs must include the semi-professional or completely professional jongleur with their musical instruments, itinerant fools with their trademark gestures and objects, and their marotte, which is kind of mock scepter, and the outspoken jesters at courts far and wide, whose witty counsel was at least intended to be somewhat corrective. To name but a few of these last, Klaus Narr, who served the Elector of Saxony in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Jane the Fool, at the court of Henry VIII, serving both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Parr, Birbal, entertainer and army officer at the Mughal court of Akbar in the 16th century. Linked to the outsider fools are outlaws or scofflaws, both fabled and documented, contrarian characters who challenged the strictures of their era and whose status and fortunes could fluctuate wildly. The stained glass is said to be a portrait of Fulk Fitzwarren, the outlaw rather in spite of himself, since supposedly following a merry game in which Fulk bested a young King John of England, the king kept giving Fulk's family castle away, with predictable results from Fulk. Make no mistake, the passage from fool to outlaw could be banefully short. Nicolas Ferial, or as he was known as, Triboulet, gesture to Kings Louis XII and Francis I of France, was threatened with death several times in the course of his prank-laden service to hot-headed Francis, and his waggish tongue ultimately got him banished from the realm. In art and narrative of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, no discussion of folly and how it engages with justice would be complete without German humanist and satirist Sebastian Brandt's poem, The Ship of Fools. The work, whose author wrote quite a bit about civil and canon law, dealt with a ship full of madmen sailing to the island of Fool's Paradise, Narragonia, and was a sensation in its day with 13 editions in 27 years, as it castigated the vices and foibles of the late 15th century with detailed woodcuts. It is thought that this work influenced German satirist Hans Sachs to write his carnival play, The Fool Cutter, in which a quack doctor cures a sick man by cutting out from his constipated bowels the 7 fools, along with others, which are in fact the 7 deadly sins or vices, their presence in his gut caused by his moral failure. You made your lusts your only laws. Of equal importance in the early Renaissance is a work juggling justice and foolishness, Erasmus' 15019 satire, The Praise of Folly, with its biting fulminations against the foolish and unjust practices of church and society. The sotis, or fool's plays of France in the 15th and 16th centuries, similarly used the errant and comical performers called sots, fools, to expose and scathingly call out all manner of societal, religious, and political ills and bring them to some engagement with justice. Sometimes this was quite literal. The anonymous play, The Sober or Leaping Fools, they made a pun, and The Sawyers, for example, held up the condemnation, for condemnation, the torture of Protestants recently burned at the stake, and was performed right in front of the Palais de Justice in Rouen, the central courthouse, in 1536. Sometimes sotis were more figurative in their castigation, though the plays were almost always topical. The rather complex so-called moralité, but it's equally a sotis, Mars and Justice, written somewhere around 1564, likewise holds up to blistering satire the French wars of religion, the Catholic Church versus the Reformers, skewing the conflict from many angles: governmental bureaucracy, commerce, law, theology. And at the end, we see a stripped down justice ultimately forced to buy her way back to some measure of peace. These and many other works of the medieval and early modern eras demonstrate that the search via foolishness for some measure of justice, along with its flip side, the sport of making a mockery of the law to restrain those who abuse power, has deep and enduring roots. Some 30 years ago, I translated for performance the sotis Les Ébahis, the astonished or amazed ones. In my translation, No Fooling with Justice. This is an anonymous fool's play from the late 15th or maybe early 16th century Northern France. I chose to restage it for this conference, though we ended up doing it in film format. There is no performance history of this mordantly satirical play, but it likely would have been as thought-provoking then as it should prove now. There will be occasion for questions and discussion after the second screening tomorrow. For now, the film will guide us into the conference topic a bit further. How might 15th century entertainers of varying talents have grappled with rampant unfairness, grievous wrongdoing, and undeserved suffering they saw around them, coursing through all levels of the social order? Is a just society possible when fools seem to be wiser than the very emblem of lawfulness and equity? Please watch as 3 outsider comics blunder their way on a very literal quest for justice in the world. All right, our first speaker is Max Harris. Max holds degrees from the University of Cambridge and California, Santa Barbara, and Virginia. He's the author of 6 books, including Aztecs, Moors, and Christians, Festivals of Reconquest in Mexico and Spain, Sacred Folly, A New History of the Feast of Fools. I can especially recommend that. Christ on a Donkey, Palm Sunday, Triumphal Entries and Blasphemous Pageants. Both Aztecs, Moors, and Christians and Sacred Folly both won the Medieval and Renaissance Drama Society's David Bevington Award for Best New Book in Early Drama Studies. Max has also written short stories and plays, one of which was performed at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. His adaptation of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure he won a performance grant from the Regents of the University of California. He's taught in the Department of Religious Studies and the Latin American Studies program at the University of Virginia, and was a visiting professor at Yale University's Divinity School. He served as executive director of the Wisconsin Humanities Council as well, and now is emeritus fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Institute for Research in the Humanities. Professor Harris today is speaking to us on Foolish Men and Holy Women, the Folly of Deluded Power, or Law and Disorder in the Age of Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Clerical Abuse, Rampant Capitalism, Me Too, and COVID-19, a study in medieval comedy. Professor Harris.
Thank you. I'm assuming, oh, wait a minute, I do share screen at this point, right? Yes. That worked beautifully. I'm stunned at my competence. Okay. There's the title, and you can see the alternative title that Sharon read too. So let's go to the next one. I don't see, oh dear. There we go. And this is where I confess that my talk is a much abbreviated version, albeit with many bonus images, of an article that I contributed to volume 2 of A Cultural History of Comedy, which came out after the original schedule for the conference, but I'm afraid before the rescheduled conference. So I was intending to present original material a year ago, but I'm going to trust that most of you haven't read this anyway. This is by way of an alternative frontispiece. It's a head of Herod, painted by a follower of Giuseppe Arcimboldo, and you'll notice Herod's skin, his flesh consists of the slaughtered innocents in the painting. Two of the things that Herod was known for in medieval drama was first the slaughter of the innocents, the other was a very painful death, being eaten by worms. This picture impresses me because it seems to me that the slaughtered innocents are doubling with the destruction of Herod. And so I show you this because we're going to start with a Herod play. In medieval Padua, during each Christmas season, clerical actors representing the biblical King Herod and his soldiers twice invaded the cathedral. The church's surviving 13th century ordinal, the latest edition of which you can see here, describes the scene. At Mass on the Feast of the Innocents, that is December the 28th, the designated reader of the epistle, and I quote from the ordinal, is dressed poorly and holds a wooden spear in his hand. He represents Herod. The morning's appointed epistle, taken from the book of Revelation, celebrates the heavenly status of Herod's martyred victims, who now wear clean robes made white in the blood of the Lamb. This by way of an alternative picture to the earlier one, and the innocents are much happier. Angered by having to read so personally humiliating a text, Herod throws his spear toward the people. This prompts further action in the nave. And there are armed men, this is again from the ordinal, there are armed men who follow the spear and go round the church seeking the child with its mother, that is Christ with the Blessed Virgin Mary. And there is someone dressed like a woman who is sitting on an ass, holding a child in her arms, and someone who represents Joseph leads the ass fleeing through the church, signifying the flight of the Virgin with her child into Egypt, as an angel of the Lord warned Joseph in a dream. It was a moment of enacted terror in the middle of Mass, but its purpose was not to terrify. Rather, it represented inept terror defeated in its own purposes. Although the child and his mother, seated on a live donkey, must have been visible to everyone else, Herod's soldiers failed to find them. Warned by an angel, the Holy Family successfully escaped into Egypt. For all his anger, Herod failed to find and to kill the one child, the Christ child, that he really wanted dead. In 13th century Padua, Herod was a comic figure. 9 days later, during the long nocturnal office of Matins on the Feast of Epiphany, that is January the 6th, Herod made his second appearance. When the 8th lesson is finished, Herod, with his chaplain, comes out of the upper sacristy, and they are dressed in the poorest, skimpy chasubles. And he has a wooden spear in his hand, which with the greatest fury he hurls toward the choir, and with as great a fury climbs up into the pulpit, and 2 scholars hold candles in front of him, and with the same fury he begins the 9th lesson. And meanwhile his ministers, with great fury, go around the choir, beating bishop, canons, and scholars with inflated bladders, and also men and women standing in the church. And sometime or another they carry away Herod's spear, which he hurled through the church. When the lesson is finished, Herod descends with his ministers, and with the aforesaid fury again goes around the choir, beating them as before. Again, it was potentially a moment of terror, but this time it was rendered even more comic by the nature of the soldiers' weapons, inflated bladders. Not only did the action in Padua Cathedral visibly emphasize the impotence of Herod's rage, but it also allowed the lay men and women standing in the church to enjoy the unusual sight of bishops, canons, and scholars being attacked with harmless but temporarily humbling bladders. This mild rite of inversion served, more importantly, as a comic representation of the ultimate ineptitude of evil. There we go. And by way of a visual aid to your imaginative reconstruction of the scene, here are 2 21st century examples of inflated bladders being used for carnivalesque rites of inversion. These are probably cows' bladders. The ones used in the Middle Ages were usually pigs' bladders on the end of a stick, which your pictures of fools share, and they had pigs' bladders on a stick. And I've seen both these examples of carnival. The Padua Representatio Herodis, representation of Herod, serves to illustrate several principles of medieval comedy and its interactions with power, or what we might call, for the purposes of this conference, disordered law. First, medieval comedy was not an exclusively secular phenomenon. It was often prescribed inside church buildings. The Representatio Herodis was no unlicensed incursion into the liturgy, but rather an annual embellishment approved by the cathedral chapter. Second, classical distinctions between comedy and tragedy rarely applied in the Middle Ages. The modern reader thinks of the slaughter of the innocents as a tragedy, a kind of small-scale Holocaust, and of Herod as the deranged tyrant responsible for the tragedy. Without denying Herod's villainy or the suffering of the innocents, the Representatio presents Herod as a doomed clown and the innocents as the first Christian martyrs welcomed directly into heaven. Third, medieval comedy can interact with both secular and ecclesiastical powers, often at the same time. Herod may be the villain of the Representatio, but when his soldiers attack the bishop, canons, and scholars with inflated bladders, both the fictional soldiers and the cathedral's real-life ruling clergy become figures of fun. Fourth, comic judgments frequently have to do not with the success or failure in the here and now, but with the character's lasting relationships to the Christian God. Herod is the butt of the play's comedy because of the ultimate futility of his rebellion against God. The innocents are the beneficiaries of the divine comedy because for all their suffering, their final ending is a blessed one. Fifth, reversals of male power can also be a source of medieval humor. This is by no means as evident in the Representatio as it is elsewhere, but it is nonetheless striking that the Virgin Mary and those traveling with her are the only active characters who emerge completely unharmed by Herod and his soldiers. In a world ruled by men, it is part of the play's good humor that a young mother and her newborn baby provide the only place of safety. Medieval comedy does not, therefore, fit easily into prevailing scholarly theories of comedy's engagement with politics and power, law and disorder. Such theories tend to focus on comedy's immediate social and political functions and effects. Mikhail Bakhtin, for example, writing under Stalin in the 1930s, celebrated carnival and the carnivalesque as a public space in which popular resistance to official restraint could be enacted. Terry Eagleton later disagreed. Carnival is a licensed affair in every sense, a permissible rupture of hegemony, a contained popular blow-off as disturbing and relatively ineffectual as a revolutionary work of art. Stephen Greenblatt, in an influential essay on Shakespeare's drama, argued that royalty and its officers allowed the representation of subversive dissent precisely in order to contain and defeat it within the terms of its own enactment. Now, fruitful as these theories may be in other contexts, none is much help in understanding medieval comedy's negotiations with disorderly politics and power. Medieval comedy celebrated a God whose comic justice would eventually set all things right. It engaged with its own social and political context, not only to ridicule and resist, but also, and more fundamentally, to set contemporary inequities and iniquities within the broader vision of Christian hope. Julian of Norwich's celebrated late 14th century affirmation that all shall be well and all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well may have been more all-embracing than was then conventional, but it remains more useful than many postmodern insights as a heuristic device for the understanding of medieval comedy. Herod was by no means the only figure of blustering male power to be portrayed in medieval performance as an absurdly comic failure. Some 200 years before the Padua Representatio Herodis, Roswitha of Gandersheim, who died around 1003, had also wrought comedy from what one scholar called the inevitable self-destructive character of evil in the face of good. A secular canoness of the Imperial Abbey of Gandersheim, Roswitha wrote 6 plays in the late 10th century. The one regarded generally as the most comic is the martyrdom of the Holy Virgins Agape, Chaonia, and Hyrena, now commonly known by the name of its most outrageously common villain, Dulcitius. The 3 young Christian virgins from noble Roman families are ordered by the pagan emperor Diocletian to marry members of his court, but are then jailed for their refusal. Dulcitius, the governor who has jurisdiction over the prison, is smitten by lust at first sight. He orders the guards to lock the girls in a room to which he has access through an adjacent kitchen. At night, the girls' hymn singing is interrupted by discordant noises from the kitchen. Peeking through a crack in the door, they see the deluded Dulcitius kissing pots and pans and fire irons. Irena says, "He's completely out of his mind. He thinks he's embracing us. Now he's fondling the pots and hugging the frying pans to his eager breast, giving them all long, sweet kisses." Emerging blackened by soot, Dulcitius is mistaken by the guards for a devil and by the emperor's doorkeepers for a monster. The former run away, the latter beat him. Finally, his wife recognizes him. "My poor Dulcitius, what's happening to you? You've lost your mind. The Christians have made a laughing stock out of you." Dulcitius angrily orders the virgins to be stripped and exposed in public, but the girls' clothes miraculously cling to their bodies. The soldiers report their failure to Diocletian, who hands the girls over to the local higher authority of one Count Sicinius. The virgins again insist on their commitment to chastity and Christ. After several miraculously botched attempts to execute the young women, Sicinius finally succeeds. The play's ultimate victory, however, belongs to the Christian martyrs. Irena's dying words are triumphant. My death will be the greatest joy to me, but a true calamity for you. You will be damned in Tartarus, that is hell, because of your evil cruelty. But I will receive the palm of martyrdom and wear the crown of virginity as I enter the heavenly bridal chamber of the eternal King. Whether or not the martyrdom of the Holy Virgins was ever performed in Hrotswitha's day, it was surely written with at least an imagined performance in mind. It has, moreover, been frequently revived in recent decades. You'll notice one of these two was in Hindi translation in India. Although these two images fail to capture the comic slapstick of Dulcitius's humiliation, a review of the Toronto production makes it clear that, and I quote, Dulcitius hilariously popped out of the kitchen during his fit, making love to a different pot or pan each time, and each time becoming darker with soot. And I can assure you that my own amateur production of this play many, many years ago stressed the comic. Dulcitius shares with Herod a comic lack of self-control and an inflated sense of his own potency. But the two characters pursue distinct ends. Whereas Herod is obsessed with the brutal preservation of his political power, Dulcitius is fixated on abusing power to indulge his sexual appetite. And here you'll begin to see where my alternative title has at least implicit applications. Neither story is likely material for an inoffensive 21st century comedy. But the medieval church was able to frame a potentially tragic series of events within a larger narrative that continued after death, and so invite both laughter at the folly of deluded and disordered power and joy at the blessings that await faithful martyrs beyond the grave. For modern readers who find this larger narrative unconvincing, it's worth remembering that Britons who had lived through World War II were able to laugh at comic representations in movies and television shows of caricatured Nazi officers failing to intimidate British prisoners of war. In both cases, it was the certainty of victory that made laughter possible. Sympathetic as we may still be to making fools of tyrants, torturers, and lechers, we are no longer comfortable doing so in the name of God. Caricatures of politicians nowadays invite collective mockery or offended protest, but not devotional piety. Nor do most of us in principle find it admirable for adherents of one religion, say Christianity, to make fun of people of other faiths, pagans in the things we've been looking at. It may come as a surprise, therefore, to find that medieval comedy was remarkably even-handed, often no less willing to mock abusive or merely self-important power when it claimed the mantle of Christianity than when power persecuted Christians in the name of other gods. Something akin to modern satirical cartoons, for example, can be found in the marginalia of illuminated manuscripts. The early 14th century Galston Psalter contains 4 marginal images of a fox dressed as a bishop preaching to ducks. The fox wears a mitre, carries a crozier, and in 3 images already has a captive duck in hand. Here's another one. In the Smithfield Decretals, taken from the same period, a mitred and croziered fox preaches to a mixed congregation of falcons, a cockerel, several geese, a stork, and a swan. Later, undisguised, the fox runs towards its den with a goose between its teeth. Episcopal rhetoric claimed that bishops were the divinely appointed shepherds of Christ's sheep. Caricaturing them as predatory foxes preying on gullible congregations was both a serious and a comic complaint. Other marginal images in the Galston Psalter depict a cross-eyed pope, unable to read a sheet of music, a naked bishop chastising a defecating monk, and 2 images of a bishop and nun ogling one another, in the second of which the bishop's robe is cut away to reveal naked thighs and barely concealed genitalia. Corrupt clergy are also targeted in the 14th century Innsbrucker Osterspiel, or Innsbruck Easter play. along with unjust secular rulers, and yet another category who appeared in Sharon's play, unscrupulous merchants. The play, by the way, is named after the University of Innsbruck, which owns the surviving manuscript, rather than after Schmalkalden, then a prosperous mining town where the play was probably transcribed and performed. After the harrowing of hell episode in the Innsbruck play, during which Christ frees Adam, Eve, and a multitude of other captive souls, Lucifer scrambles to refill his now underpopulated domain. He screams loudly at his second in command, Satan, and at the other devils before giving them orders. Satan, Satan, my good old friend, run down to Avignon, bring me the Pope and the cardinals, this is at the time of the Great Schism, the patriarchs and legates who give the people such bad counsel. Bring to me all at once the king and the emperor, the princes and earls. Bring me the bailiff and the town councillor who have done great injustice to the people. And also bring me the usurers, the priest with his bald spot, the monk in his cowl. The long list of those fit to repopulate hell continues with a roll call of merchants, tradesmen, and generally disreputable members of local society. The pub keeper, the baker, the butcher, the weaver, the carpenter, the shoemaker, the cobbler, the beer handler and the barrel maker, bag makers, potters, spurriers, fletchers, sawyers and mill hands, drinkers, dice shooters and gamblers, the miller, the barber, the salt trader, the blacksmith, the fisherman, the boatman, the piper and the harper, the drummer and the fiddler, and every kind of minstrel. The play was almost certainly performed outdoors in a town square or open marketplace. Here is Schmalkalden today. That's probably the square where it was performed. And because of the situation, the masked devils of the play would have been able to make forays into the audience in search of appropriate victims. While the devils would not have found genuine rather than enacted cardinals or princes, they would have found local tradesmen. Why the latter professions might deserve hell is explained in 6 confessions of damned souls. 4 are dishonest traders. They include a pub keeper who poured out too short a measure, and a butcher who slaughtered a worm-infested sow and then swore it was a healthy little piggy. The other 2 are a chaplain who preferred the company of women to his clerical duties, and a lover who made love to maidens for a nickel, to women for a loaf of bread. A cynically comic note is struck by Lucifer's response to the professional lover's promiscuity. Satan, dear friend, don't let that one into hell. If he ever gets into my hell, we'll be overrun with little bastards. One might not expect medieval Christians, who it is reasonable to suppose believed in the reality of hell, to have found in it a source of comedy. This preconception may explain the difficulties experienced by modern art historians when confronted by the 13th century Last Judgment carved in stone in the tympanum of the Prince's Portal leading into the north side of the nave of Bamberg Cathedral in northern Bavaria. And this will be the last item we'll look at, though we'll look at it fairly closely. The blessed souls on Christ's right hand, it is generally agreed, smile with undisguised pleasure at their happy fate. While the smiles of the saved might strike the modern art historian as perhaps a little smug, the real interpretive problem rests with the damned on Christ's left hand, who also appear to be smiling. One critical response is to ignore this impression and insist on a conventional reading. The damned consist of 5 terrified figures transfixed with fear, their faces contorted into masks of helpless misery. It's hard to see how that can be in the picture, but there you go. Another response is to admit that the damned do appear to be smiling, but to explain this in terms of a representational convention that lasted well into the Renaissance, whereby a weeping mouth usually turned upward. The Bamberg damned, in other words, were initially depicted as weeping, not smiling, but since we now understand an upturned mouth to indicate a smile, we mistakenly find their expressions ambiguous and self-contradictory. Yet another response is to take the smiles of the damned at face value, but to interpret them negatively. What if the discomfort these figures provoke flows not simply from an outdated artistic convention, but also from our sense of the perverse glee, the demented pleasure with which these figures greet their damnation? An even more negative reading admits that both the saved and the damned are smiling, but notes that the smiles of the damned are accompanied by uncontrolled gesticulations, flailing arms, contorted bodies, squinting eyes, raised eyebrows, meant to remind the viewer of the unholy aspect of the smile of sin, lechery, and damnation, of hopeless hysteria, and the panicked frenzy of madness before the gates of hell. None of these critical responses rings true to me. A more fruitful approach may be to focus not on the emotions of the stone figures, but on those of a hypothetical medieval viewer. I confess that when I first saw the Bamberg tympanum, my immediate response was to smile, even to laugh. This was not, I trust, a case of perverse pleasure at others' suffering, nor was it simply that incongruity is a common source of humor and that the laughter of the damned struck me as comically incongruous. Nor was it even that laughter is contagious, irresistibly tickling me to laugh with rather than at the damned. I suspect that another, more consoling comic convention came into play, one that was widely operative in the Middle Ages. To appreciate this convention, we must first take into account the identities of the damned in the Bamberg tympanum. The 5 doomed figures are led by chained by a devil who impudently sticks his tongue out at the viewer. They include a king, there you can see his crown, a pope or bishop, a miser or prosperously unscrupulous merchant holding a bag of money, and 3 others who are not easily identified. The saved, by contrast, include only one figure of power, who is also the only full-sized adult male, wearing a crown. He is presumably a just king who is rather endearingly holding his wife's hand. The others are 3 women, one of whom may be Mary Magdalene, here with the jar of perfume, and 3 smaller figures, possibly children or people of lower social status. The differences in worldly wealth and status between the saved and the damned are striking. It was, as we have seen, a comic convention of the Middle Ages to derive humor from divine justice's refusal to privilege the powerful, the rich, and all who exploit their neighbors. The impotent rage of the Padua Herod, the comic ineptitude of Roswitha's Dulcitius, and in the Innsbruck Easter play, the repopulation of hell with everyone from kings and popes to crooked pub keepers and butchers, all depended on this convention for their comic effect. Such delight in the downfall of the powerful and corrupt, and in the rescue of the powerless and disadvantaged, had a solid biblical and liturgical precedent. The Magnificat, first sung according to the Gospel of Luke by the Virgin Mary, and subsequently incorporated into the daily office of Vespers, still celebrates such reversals. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent empty away. A similar, but not specifically religious response can be found wherever people laugh. A poor child who slips on a banana skin prompts, or at least should prompt, pity. But a self-important man of power, ostentatious dress, pompous gait, and great girth who slips on a banana skin is considered fair game for hilarity. Medieval comedy applied this biblical and broadly human principle to its representations of power and privilege. I believe it was also at play in the Bamberg Last Judgment, where the medieval artist skillfully induced laughter by means of incongruity and contagion, not as an end in itself, but so that his viewers might also and more profoundly find themselves taking delight in the divine inclination celebrated in the Magnificat to put down the mighty from their seat and to exalt the humble and meek. Faith in divine reversal was the common stance of medieval comedy toward the abuse of power. I had hoped to close with some brilliant insights into how all this applies to the problem raised by my subtitle of Law and Disorder in the Age of Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Clerical Abuse, Rampant Capitalism, Me Too, and COVID-19. But I find I have neither the insights, nor, even if I had them, any remaining time. I grant that it might have been consoling sometime in the last 4 years to have staged a Herod play in which Herod wore a Trump mask, and in the interests of political neutrality, a version of Horoswitha's play in which Dulcitius sounded uncannily like Bill Clinton. But to stage these comedies in such a way would, I fear, be to treat too lightly those who are victims of abusive or unjust power. Medieval comedy found its consolation in the belief that those martyred by sexual predators or powerful narcissists won immediate entry into the glories of heaven. In our own age, when confidence in divine judgment is by and large absent or at best sparse, it would be callous to ask victims of racism, sexual assault, or any other injustice to find comfort, let alone laughter, in the triumphant happy ending of medieval Christian comedy. Perhaps it would be better to pray, if it makes sense for us to do so, and to work as best we can for daily bread to be available for all, for debts to be forgiven, for evil to be overcome, and for peace, justice, dignity, and safety to be enjoyed by all now, here, on earth, as it is, or so we hope, in heaven. Thank you.
Well, we will begin now with our history, a couple of history papers. Our first speaker is Piotr Górecki. He is professor of history at the University of California at Riverside, specializing in economic, social, and legal history of medieval Poland. His books include Economy, Society, and Lordship in Medieval Poland, A Local Society in Transition, the Henrikov Book and Related Documents, and most recently, The Text and the World, the Henrikov Book, its authors in their region 1160 to 1310. Among other editorial work, he's co-editor of Conflict in Medieval Europe, Changing Perspectives in Society and Culture. And I think he also runs the scholars, I guess it's every 3 or 4 months convening to do historical workshops out at the Huntington, or at least it used to be. I think everything is virtual now. He is speaking today on Laughter as Power, One Small Story of Loss and Recovery. And thank you very much, Professor Górecki.
Well, thank you, Sharon, for that wonderful introduction. And I would like to begin with warm thanks to you, Sharon, to the center, as always, and its wonderful staff, Erin, Karen, Brett, Zrinka, who are all here, for the invitation to this wonderful, highly imaginative conference and this wonderful exercise in the inclusion of me in it. And with an acknowledgement of 3 big subjects framing the conference, or at least aspects of it in my paper, that, like so much that is good about our profession, just keep on giving. One is foolery or foolishness, by which here is meant obviously not stupidity in general, but one kind of defiance of order. Another is disorder more generally, and its linkage with law and justice. The third is an absolutely fascinating primary source, a Cistercian monastic history, now conventionally known as the Henrikov Book, to which Sharon very kindly alluded, which among its other valuable attributes takes us into those subjects. It does so by means of one specific strand of narrative, spanning at least 3 generations, and the years from approximately the 1160s to 1245 or 1268, depending on the cutoff of that story we want to adopt. The book in its entirety is a history of the Cistercian monastery in Henrikov in Lower Silesia, written by the monks at the monastery, and concerning as its main subjects the monastery's foundation, sometime between 1222 and 1228, under the patronage of Duke Henry the Bearded, The relationships resulting from that foundation, relationships, a network of which centered on the monastery, and the course of acquisition by the monks of an estate accumulated across approximately 1 century since and including that foundation. In its early phases, this process entailed the displacement of an early indigenous Polish or Slavic population, followed over time by the formation of granges, recruitment of a new, mostly or largely German tenant peasantry, and acquisition by the monastery of specialized resources, above all fisheries and lucrative urban space. These subjects and the source itself closely link with at least one of our framing themes, namely disorder. This is because the explicit purpose of the book is to offset the likelihood of disarray and fragmentation in a concrete sense, that is, of the material components of the estate itself, its holdings and other resources, and on an abstract level of knowledge, a kind of secure, reliable, and truthful, from the monk's perspective, knowledge about that estate, its components, its history, and the significance of all the above. The book consists of 2 major sections, which the authors call libri. The first written after 1268 by the monastery's 3rd abbot, Peter. The second after 1310, probably by the 2nd abbot of the same name. Between them, the 2 sections include each one separate preamble, which in the first section is followed by a much longer story of the monastery's foundation, and a total of 16 short histories, micro-histories as I like to call them, of individual localities that the monastery received at the foundation and subsequently over much of the following century. Sometime after 1310, these texts were gathered into one codex, currently possessed by the library of the Archdiocese of Wrocław. My specific strand of narrative occurs in the first, earlier section composed by Abbot Peter. It is a core part of one of those 16 short histories of individual localities, in this case, a locality called Głębowice in Peter's present. Like some, but by no means all of Peter's narration, this short history and this particular strand within that history extend chronologically all the way back to the earliest past accessible to Peter, and as we will momentarily see, to some of the earliest actors whom Peter described in his work. That earlier past is the years soon after the mid-12th century. The reign of the Duke of Silesia named Bolesław the Tall, exactly datable at 1163 to 1201. The strand culminates, in one sense ends in 1245, with the death of an old, completely disabled peasant by the name of Kwiecik. For me today, he is the main protagonist or actor linking and personally embodying this source with at least some of the themes of our conference. Let me turn to Kwiecik's importance counter-chronologically, that is back following Peter's story, except backwards, back to the earliest moment in this strand, extending at least 3 generations into Kwiecik's past. This early period and the bundle of subjects the author discerned in that period were of great interest to Peter throughout the work. The subjects included, first, expansion of rural settlement, arable and land use under ducal lordship, beginning with Bolesław the Tall and continuing under the duke's son, Henry the Bearded. This entailed recruitment of peasants, as they are called formally ducal peasants, rustici ducis, an indigenous Polish rural population, as well as more open-ended social groups, as Peter called them, noble and the mediocre, who included knights, explicitly so called, people aspiring to knighthood, and others, who are not always expressly classified by status, group membership, or ethnicity. All such immigrants, in any event, were in varied ways entrusted with land clearing and creation of settlement and rural estates. As a subset of this material, people conveyed the personal stories straddling the long aftermath of some especially interesting or notable places and their possessors. Some such stories work as sharp, vivid biographical glimpses and indeed blossom into quite full, nicely narrated biographies. Of this kind of narrative, our ducal peasant Kwiecik is an excellent example, as an actor, but also as a culminating figure in a longer multi-generational biographical story. This genealogical fragment spanning several generations is the subject of my specific strand of narrative. It all begins with in the deep past of, again, in quote, the old days when the Dukes of Silesia were distributing inheritances and manors to the noble and the mediocre. And this is in the region that subsequently became the site of the monastery and its estate, as well as we know from other sources, and elsewhere throughout the duchy. In the earliest part of that early period, again, in Peter's words, the days when the old duke was distributing lands to his peasants in diverse places, he gave a forest to a certain own peasant of his, a complex phrase in English, which is a translation from quidam rustico suo proprio, by the name of Głąb. Immediately at this opening moment in his narration, Peter noted two events directly tied to Głąb's recruitment and arrival. Events that bridged this originating peasant settler with the past and with Peter's present, as viewed from the abbot's own perspective. These events were expenditure of labor and the creation of place names. In the newly acquired forest, Głąb, again in Peter's words, first cleared the place that is now, that is to say, that is in Peter's present, from his perspective, in a place that is now called the Great Meadow, or Wielka Łąka in Polish, adding the vernacular. Hence, Peter adds, the entire district of this forest was long ago called Głębowice, after the name of the said peasant. Excuse me. To summarize, after his recruitment, Głąb promptly turned to clearing and cultivation of land. The name elicited by the clearing, Great Meadow, suggests that the extent or outcome of that labor was in some sense substantial, or at least so that was so perceived by whatever population generated this place name. The next bit of narrative is a strong chronological move forward, incorporating but also abbreviating Głąb's successors. This peasant remained in Great Meadow and was then succeeded by two generations of heirs, heredes, about the first of whom, that is his son, we know it was a son, but otherwise we know nothing. But the second generation brings me to the most important actor in my narrative fragment. Preeminent among Głąb's heirs, again thus identified, was Kwiecik, whom Peter, again right at the outset of the story of that protagonist, situated as an actor, in this case, along three lines: as a peasant, again rusticus, as son of the son of Głąb, again Peter's words, and as, again in Peter's words, exceeding the others, that is presumably other peasants present in Great Meadow, in power. The word Peter used was potentia. Now, so let me pause to note in this, to me, unusually thick bit of biographical material, the conjunction of specialization and status, peasant, ducal peasant, leadership, and above all, that power. A kind of power that was, to be sure, socially circumscribed, relating Kwiecik toward other heirs or peasants, not toward some other larger world. Yet from Abbot Peter's perspective, worth noting and passing on to his readers many, many decades later. Sometime later in Kwiecik's life, this rural group encountered its first moment of trauma. Peter's narration again. In that place, that is to say, still in Great Meadow, Kwiecik and his followers were oppressi, by the grandfather or possibly the ancestor, the word here is atavus, of a certain Moiko. Peter did not specify the nature of the oppression or identify the actual oppressor or say anything else about his descendant Moiko. Thus, both men remain entirely unknown, shadow characters of sorts. Nevertheless, they were transgressive, disorderly, and evil. Interestingly, in a reversal of his usual mode of reckoning of kinship and descent, Abbot Peter traced the culprit in a reverse genealogical order, upward and back across 2 or more generations from a later, implicitly well-known named person, Moiko, whom again, Peter did not chronologically or otherwise situate in this story. The collective response by the group to the oppression was a continuation of settlement and land clearing. Under Kwiecik's leadership, the heirs of this peasant, again as Peter calls them, resettled about 1 kilometer to the east toward an elevation, which Peter, with much overstatement, called a mountain. And as he explained further, where the orchard stands now, or the monastery's orchard stands now, and next to the monastery's farmstead, Kuria. That is to say, and this is me adding, one of those granges situated on the same spot in Abbot Peter's present. In the new location, Kwiecik replicated his grandfather's earlier clearing, quoting Peter again here. After Kwiecik departed with his heirs from Great Meadow, he established a village, Lokavil Villam, in the place where the farmstead, that is to say that grange I just mentioned, now stands. This was presumably, I would guess, pure speculation, immediately adjacent to that elevation or mountain. Once again, Peter immediately used this outcome to explain a place name, which here too bridged a key actor in his impact across that deep past and Peter's present. Peter's words, and so this place was at that time called Kwiecikowice, which name is still used by some for it until now. These initiatives trace out very local fluctuation, but over a very long time, of land clearing and settlement, and reflect and register, albeit across a huge empirical gradient, darkly and fleetingly, something we usually can't even begin to glimpse in our documents: peasant agency, power, though power meant in an extremely local situational sense, and including extending to its impediments, limitations, or reversals. Now, of these themes, the entire remainder of Kwiecik's life, from this moment of settlement, resettlement onward, provides an absolutely lovely case study. In his new location, Kwiecik again encountered violent resistance, whose effects this time were permanent and devastating. Peter tells us, again, these are in his words, that in the days when the monastery had just been founded, and that places that phase of things sometime after 1222, probably closer to 1228, resuming Peter's words, this peasant was completely disabled by sword cuts. He lacked one hand, and his other was so damaged by his sword that he couldn't move it at all. As a result, from that time onward, he was, again, Peter's words, extremely poor in body and in things. In contrast to the earlier episode of oppression, in this case, the culprit, or anything else about the culprit's situational context, such as ancestry or kinship going in either direction, are completely unknown. We know about the weapon and the nature of the injury, but not who wielded the weapon, why, or actually really when. Also in sharp contrast, the result was not another migration or resettlement, an act of which Kwiecik was now presumably physically incapable, but apparently the dispersal of the entire village, reflected by the reversion of its site to a forest acquired by the monastery much, much later, as we know from other details of this particular story. Let me get back to Kwiecik. We have here a remarkable glimpse of a loss of personal position, capacity, or agency, expressly so described by Peter's use of the medieval discourse of a fall in fortune, from power to poverty, from potens to pauper. However, no less importantly, in the rest of this fragment of narrative, the abbot gives us an equally vivid glimpse of Kwiecik's restoration through his action, through his agency, restoration of those qualities. A restoration for which one tool, one social resource, was the disability itself. Soon after Abbot Peter's second chronological great slide forward in this narrative fragment, towards much later, many years later, Kwiecik's reappearance in the Henrykov monastery itself, this peasant managed to transform his descent or former descent into poverty into an asset. So now, more happily with Abbot Peter, I turn to this subject. Kwiecik concluded his long life in what could be called a retirement, in a state of complete dependence on the monks. Again, Peter's words. Because he was extremely poor in body and things and very old, Abbot Henry and his successor, Abbot Bodo, sustained him with victuals until his death. Peter did not say that Kwiecik actually resided at the monastery, but since he added that across the reigns of those two particular abbots, who are quite datable, the old peasant, again, his words, often ate bread here since the time of the monastery's foundation. Kwiecik was at least regularly present in the monastic space over more than 20 years, until his death in 1245, which of course is why 1245 provides one of my ending points chronologically of this particular story. Over those years, Kwiecik, on his side, was of benefit to the monastery as the monks' informant about the earliest history of settlement, population, and landscape in what later became the monastery and its estate. Stories presumably not nearly concerning him, but a number of other early inhabitants who are a wonderful subject of this part of the Henrykov book, including other ducal peasants. And this is material that Peter richly used and incorporated in his history. Now, at this point, returning to thick biography as a mode, Peter explained this knowledge by reiterating Kwiecik's nexus of status, descent, and age. Again, Peter's words, Kwiecik was a peasant, son of the son of Gomb, and very old, so he recalled the events across many years. Peter expressly tied this memorial role to the sustenance that Kwiecik received from the monastery in both directions. Again, Peter speaking, because of the hospitality and maintenance he received, the old peasant narrated to us all the antiquities of the inheritances situated around the territory of the monastery. And of course, that being a spatial benchmark of Peter's present. Kwiecik's transmission of knowledge in return for life-saving assistance is here presented as a recovery, the formation of an important, permanent relationship between this man and one crucially important actor, namely the monastery and the group of monks, and of course, Peter himself. But there is more. Kwiecik's disability completely transformed his significance toward other important actors. That disability became his memorable defining feature, much as his power and labor had been decades earlier. It was a socially or societally noted trait because it elicited, again, presumably from some contemporary population which we otherwise know existed, a nickname for him. The nickname sounds ironic and disturbing to us, but there's no evidence that it was back then. In Peter's words, because Kwiecik lacked one hand and had no use for the other, the Poles at that time called him the stump. In addition, Kwiecik's comportment, while in that state, led to a relationship with the Duke, which in my view is the closest tie-in with the picture of a fool in heavy quotes, which we have seen from different angles at this conference, led to a relationship with Duke. Again, quoting, Kwiecik often moved Duke Henry and his retinue to great laughter with his trickery and wonders. So in his days, he was esteemed above all his kinsmen at the Duke's court. That's the quote. We don't quite know what the nature of the trickery and wonders was, but we do know, we can see, or at least glimpse here, a sustained performance. So here was another level of recovery. Through a combination of disability and humor, Kwiecik maintained himself quite literally in the public view before significant others, and presumably a broader population, including the population that generated a nickname for him, and in subsequent collective memory, or at least knowledge worth keeping. What Peter left completely unexplained was Kwiecik's remaining other important role. The fact that shortly before his death, the monks, as Peter puts it, obtained through him Głębowice, one of those localities that much earlier had, so to speak, enjoyed the imprint of his labor and that of his lineage. What happened here? In addition to collecting his knowledge, did the monks benefit from Kwiecik's fall of fortune by an actual acquisition? In this particular case, we don't know. We have similar stories, by the way, about other early settlers, but not this one. Be that as it may, in its cumulative sense, Kwiecik's role prompted Abbot Peter to instruct the monks, again, in his words, that our successors should deem it worthy to pray for this peasant Kwiecik. This is, by the way, the only inclusion anywhere in the book of a peasant, especially explicitly so identified, in this history's otherwise rich necrological and commemorative message and purpose. In view of Kwiecik's disability and transformation of his role, it is not surprising that between the 1220s and the 1260s, the name of the holding he had cleared many years earlier shifted from reference to him. Interestingly, back to the reference to the ancestor of the whole lineage long gone. Yet the memories of Głąb and Kwiecik were not entirely eclipsed. Peter noted that today, many decades after 1228, the earlier names for the localities with which they had been associated remained in use, at least some social use. As he put it, this forest retains the name Głębowice among some Poles today, while the name Kwiecikowice is still used for the holding cleared by Kwiecik by some until right until now. This aggregation of place names, markers of the link between space and people, reflects a tension between long-term change in the uses of and rights in land and the continuous remembrance about the earliest protagonists who had pioneered those uses and generated those rights through thick and thin, and one of whom, as we have seen, was simply, in the multiple meanings of that word, extraordinarily interesting. Thank you.
William Bradford Smith is recently retired from Oglethorpe University, where he was Manning M. Patillo, a junior professor of liberal arts. Currently, he is a consultant with the Coventry Association for Pastoral Theology. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Michigan and received his PhD from Emory University. His book, Reformation and the German Territorial State, was published by University of Rochester Press in 2008. Recent publications include 2 book chapters, The Persecution of Witches and the Discourse on Toleration in Early Modern Germany, and From Myth to Matter, Ulrich Molitor's De Lamis, 1489, and The Construction of Witchcraft. He's currently finishing up a book on the persecution of witches in early modern Germany. And his paper today is titled The Criminalization of Disobedience in Counter-Reformation Germany.
All right. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to begin with an observation. Machiavelli once said that the surest way to get into the historical record was by committing a crime. And for those of us who work in social history, and I've been researching witch trials now for about 25 years, we spend a lot of our time looking at people and knowing them simply because they committed a crime or were accused of a crime. Now that can give one a rather skewed view of history, particularly because although I've looked at cases of thousands of people over the years, I rarely get to know who they are. The details are lacking. You see them in that moment when they're called before the court, but what happened before they committed the crime or were accused of the crime and what happens afterwards, much of that is lost to the historical record. 2 exceptions to that rule are the 2 fellows I want to talk about today, Jakob Schwarzlein and Pankratz Kümmelmann, both from the little town of Staffelstein in the old Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg. So it's just up the street there from that lovely image of the Last Judgment. Staffelstein was something of a juridical anomaly. It was under the direct jurisdiction of the Bamberg Cathedral chapter. Now, that has a couple of implications for our studies, but one of them is this. We have pretty much the complete minutes of the cathedral chapter's meetings from the end of the 15th century up until the secularization of the diocese in 1803. The minutes cover meetings that were held generally 3 times a week. Now, for those of you who have spent time, and anyone in the academy has done this, you've probably spent a lot of time having to read minutes from meetings. And very often the reports that show up in these minutes are fairly cursory. Not so with our 2 malefactors. Pankratz Kümmelmann and Jakob Schwarzlein appear in the minutes of the chapter more than 60 times between 1609 and 1623. And throughout most of these documents, the crime that is attributed to them is simply described as a failure to obey. Now, disobedience is a word that shows up a great deal in the documents from the Counter-Reformation era. A 1595 document from the neighboring town of Zeil lists the heads of every household. Each householder then has next to his name obediens or pertinax, obedient or pertinacious, disobedient. In this context, the meaning is fairly clear. What it refers to is whether or not the person mentioned, the head of the household, was willing to receive communion in the Catholic manner at Easter. Similar lists were collected from other communities throughout the Prince-Bishopric. The penalties for disobedience in this sense could be quite severe. The standard fine was 10 gulden, which is basically about 6 weeks' wages. I have seen fines as high as 100 gulden for refusing to receive communion. On several occasions, the bishop sent troops into villages where people had refused to take communion to force them literally at the point of a sword to confess at Easter. In some instances, we have towns where people are ordered to go into exile. They were given 7 days, either receive communion in the Catholic manner or sell their goods and depart. Obedience, in other words, was often secured through the pikeman and the musketeer, although there were exceptions. When the troops were sent in to impose a marriage ordinance, the local noble sent out his own troops. And instead of being simply armed with pikes and muskets, they were armed with cannon. And the bishop's men had to back down and the wedding went ahead as scheduled. Now, the cathedral chapter at Bamberg was actually pretty easygoing with regard to this. Staffelstein was an ecclesiastical immunity, and the bishop and the chapter was extremely protective of its rights and those of its residents. The magistrates operated with a degree of forbearance that is rather rare in 17th century Germany. At the same time, their patience could be tried, and Pankratz Kummelmann and Jakob Schwarzlein proved to be a source of frustration for over 20 years. Pankratz Kummelmann was a clockmaker, and he first appears in the minutes on August 14th, 1601, in conjunction with a dispute over his wife's inheritance. His wife, Kunigunda, was a member of the Lemblein family. And remember that name, Lemblein, because it's going to keep coming up. Her brother Klaus Lemblein and his wife had died somewhere in around 1598, not exactly clear. And the matter of his estate had never been properly settled. The amount in question was sizable. The local tax assessor valued the estate at 1,700 gulden, but said that at auction it was going to get much more, and some estimates ran as high as 3,000 gulden, which is a pretty sizable piece of change in 1601. Much of the dispute had to do with cash that was in the Lemblein household when Klaus and his wife passed away. Kunigunda's 3 siblings, Martin, Hans, Anna, and Barbara, were in the house at the time that their brother and sister-in-law passed away. Thereafter, so Kummelmann claimed, the money disappeared. Kummelmann claimed that his in-laws had hidden all of the cash so that his wife Kunigunda could not collect. An inquest was convened, and they found nothing improper. This is where the problems began. Kummelmann refused to let go of the matter. Instead, he openly started telling anyone who would listen that his in-laws were a bunch of thieves. When the magistrate told him to remain quiet, Kummelmann refused. He was then threatened with jail. The aftermath is not clear. Kunigunda Kummelmann, his wife, claimed her husband had spent 3 years away dealing with the after effects of her brother's death, dealing with financial matters. According to the local magistrate, Kummelmann was a fugitive from justice who was hiding from his proper punishment. Kummelmann returned to Staffelstein 3 years later, and he was promptly arrested and tossed in jail. His crime at this point was threefold. 1, he had refused to accept the judgment of the court. 2, he had continued to slander his in-laws even after being ordered not to. And 3, he had violated his oath as a burgher to uphold the law. From prison, Kummelmann now sent out a set of petitions. One was addressed to the bishop, another to the cathedral chapter. More seriously, he appealed his case to the Reichskammergericht, the Imperial Supreme Court. The court looked very favorably on his petition, and in the name of the Emperor Rudolf II, issued a mandate and demanded that the bishop and chapter respond to Kummelman's charges. In a detailed response, the Prince Bishop offered his view of the matter. He described Kummelman as a man who had thumbed his nose at legally constituted authority and then abandoned his wife and children in an impudent, wanton, and insolent manner. In the bishop's judgment, Kummelman's description of the events was accurate in a general sense, but left out very important details. Of particular concern were his insinuations concerning the officials. It also left out the vital fact, according to the bishop, that of Kummelman's frevel, his criminal mischief. He had repeatedly defamed the characters of his in-laws, particularly his sisters-in-law. The case had been reviewed by the chapter. 2 canons and experts in law, probably members of the bishop's own council, had examined the evidence and interviewed witnesses and found nothing improper. Although Martin Lemblein had offered his sister 100 gulden as compensation, Kummelman refused it and continued to insult his relatives. More seriously, he refused to swear the oath of reconciliation, the urfede, for swearing any further action against either the local officials or his relatives. The next time Kummelman appears is December 1605, when his wife filed a petition for his release. The verdict of the cathedral chapter was clear. Pankraz Kummelman was ein öffentlicher Landsbefehlen, a notorious outlaw conducting a private war against the state. When Kunigunde Kummelman died in 1607, local officials rejected her husband's bid for clemency and appointed his brother as guardian and of his children and custodian of the undisputed portion of his wife's estate. I like that undisputed clarification. 2 years later, in May 1609, Kummelman asked, in all humility, to be set free. Prison had changed him, he said. He was a better man and willing to render all due obedience. The local magistrate disagreed, adding blasphemy to the charges against the prisoner. According to the jailer, and Kummelman confirmed this, one day Kummelman had asked him whether a recent hailstorm had damaged the crops in the next village over. The jailer said yes, the hail had caused great damage. Kummelman then asked him if the magistrates were going to ask God to swear the urfede and promise not to do it again. In the years that followed, Kummelman repeatedly asked to be released. Every time, the chapter considered his request carefully, called on legal advice, but despite his protestations, they continued to find him contumacious. In personal interviews with the chapter's lawyers, he remained, quote, ungrateful, insolent, and godless. In October 1619, 17 years after his initial arrest, the jurists admitted that Kummelman's treatment was subject to dispute and perhaps unfair. He remained in jail, stubborn as ever, though, for another 4 years. For much of his incarceration, Kummelman shared his cell with Jakob Schwarzlein. The two were relatives, though not likely friends. Schwarzlein was married to Barbara Lemblein, one of the 4 siblings Kummelman had been jailed for insulting. In 1608, Schwarzlein found himself embroiled in 2 disputes that arose after the death of his wife. All this goes back to the original disputed will, by the way. Barbara Lemblein had been, as you might recall, one of the beneficiaries of the will of her father. In her will, she listed her brother Hans and 2 other men, Pankraz Weckmann and Hans Weinmann, as beneficiaries. The relationship between the 3 is unclear. At the time of after his wife's death, Schwarzlein claimed that she had revoked her will and refused to pay either men what they claimed was their share of her inheritance. Lemblein, Weckmann, and Weinmann all filed petitions. Although the amounts were relatively small in this case, totaling no more than 60 gulden, Schwarzlein's insolent and wanton behavior quickly became the primary issue. Weckmann in particular complained about the injuries he and his wife had suffered on account of Schwarzlein's insulting and slanderous speech. One complication was that the 3 claimants all lived in the neighboring principality of Saxe-Coburg, the birthplace of the Prince Consort for Queen Victoria fans. At the request of Weckmann and Weinmann, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg intervened and conducted his own independent investigation. The local authorities in Staffelstein and the Duke of Coburg unanimously came to the same conclusion. Schwarzlein had been less than honest. Schwarzlein was arrested, but released on caution. This did not end the matter. Although Lemblein's claim on the estate was declared valid, there simply was not enough money to pay him in full. Subsequently, Schwarzlein countersued, and in 1610, officials in Staffelstein found themselves again having to caution him over his behavior. In May 1611, he was cautioned a third time and ordered to desist specifically from molesting Beckmann. Schwarzlein would not abandon his suit, though. He produced ever more documents and witnesses. According to one court official, 5, 6, 10 good-for-nothing people at a time were called in. By July 1612, the officials were at their wits' end. Schwarzlein was ordered to content himself with the original judgment of the court and stop slandering his opponents. For the next 4 years, we hear nothing of Schwarzlein. Then, in August 1616, he again appears before the court. By now, matters had changed. The Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg was in the midst of a large-scale witch hunt. Staffelstein was one of the first communities affected. Consequently, local officials were not in a particularly generous mood. Schwarzlein had continued his ongoing feud with his brother-in-law. The court berated Schwarzlein for his shameless disobedience and sentenced him to imprisonment on bread and water. He could return home as soon as he promised to behave better. Schwarzlein agreed, but then lapsed into his old habits. On May 11, 1618, he was back in custody, this time for violating the Urfede, the oath of reconciliation that he had sworn 2 years before. For breaking the oath, he was sentenced to have the 2 fingers of the hand with which he had sworn the oath chopped off. Short 2 fingers, Schwarzlein continued to languish in his jail cell. In August 1619, his wife, he seems to have remarried at some point in the intervening period, petitioned to let him be put on free foot once again. At this stage, he and Kommelmann's story begin to intertwine. The Prince Bishop ordered that the 2 men could be set free now, but on one condition. Schwarzlein was a Catholic. He had actually left Coburg to move to Bamberg specifically because he wanted to live in a Catholic area. He was asked if he would simply confess and receive communion. Kommelmann was not a Catholic, although nothing ever says that he was a Protestant either. But he was told that he also had to confess and receive communion in the Catholic manner. Thereafter, both men would have to promise, quote, as much as possible to behave with respect to the Catholic religion, as much as possible. The report that the cathedral chapter received on their answer was not promising. Both Kommelmann and Schwarzlein responded to the bishop's offer, quote, with all kinds of shocking blasphemies, offensive and criminally reprehensible speech, unquote. In the summer of 1620, a new jail was built. Schwarzlein and Kommelmann were the first residents. Although Schwarzlein also, again, petitioned for his release, it said that he would not leave off with his blasphemies, insults, and curses. In August, it was ordered, and no one knows exactly why, that he be locked up in a new prison on bread and water for 8 days. At the end of that 8 days, they hoped that he would come to his senses. Meanwhile, a search was ordered of his house. After the report of the search came back, the cathedral chapter sent a notice to the magistrates in Staffelstein demanding that they interrogate Schwarzlein and ask him the following questions. 1, where had he obtained the wax Agnus Dei found in his house? 2, what sort of herbs and roots were in the little bag that he had? 3, who had given him a severed human finger? 4, what was the smashed bowl all about? 5, for what purposes had he carried these items around with him? 6, why had he saved the water that had gathered in his straw mattress? And 7, for what reason had he refused to tend the fire in his cell? Initially, the local magistrates, based on his answers to the question, decided that he was not a sorcerer or a witch, but just simply a fool. Consequently, on October 6th, it was ordered that, accompanied by a piper, Schwarzlein be transferred to the Narrenhaus, the fool's house. This was a cell on the corner of the council building that opened out onto the main square, where the prisoner could be mocked by passersby. A month after moving to his new quarters, however, the chapter decided the matter was more serious and ordered Schwarzlein to be tortured, specifically about the human finger. By this time, Schwarzlein's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Initially, he refused to answer questions. When he did cooperate, his answers were described as incoherent. For a year, he languished in the Narrenhaus, presumably enduring the constant abuse of his former neighbors. On November 29th, 1621, Schwarzlein escaped his prison. Somehow he broke the shackles and chains and then forced the door. He was caught only a few days later hiding in a woodshed. His horrible cries alerted the authorities to his presence. On June 17th, 1622, he broke out again. When captured, he spouted all kinds of godless, scandalous language. On September 23rd, 1622, he escaped prison for the third time. Although through all of this time, he was never really formally charged with a crime. And in fact, for a second time, the court absolved him of the charge of witchcraft. By this time, in the last escape attempt, the officials decided that he was completely insane and that it was pointless to pursue the matter. On April 21st, 1623, the cathedral chapter was notified that Jakob Schwarzlein and Pankratz Kummelmann were dead. No cause was given, though the implications were discussed at great length. Schwarzlein died suddenly. A priest had been called to hear his confession and administer last rites, but arrived too late. Now the priest and chaplain were unsure what to do with the body. The chapter ordered that as an act of mercy, he should be buried in consecrated ground in the churchyard, but in, quote, a particular place set aside for criminals executed with the sword and bodies found in the street, unquote. The canons expressed their relief that Kummelmann had agreed to confess and receive communion in the Catholic manner just before his death. That meant that he too could be buried in the churchyard. So the two cellmates were buried next to each other with the ordinary ceremonies. There, their story ends. Jakob Schwarzlein and Jakob Kummelmann spent a sizable portion of their adult lives in jail. Why? Neither committed a capital crime. Rather, the two men spent decades behind bars because they refused to keep their mouths shut. Their crime, in other words, was disobedience. The two men are regularly described as mutwillig, wantonly insolent. All that would have been required for them to obtain their freedom was to obey the court's charge to keep quiet. But this was the sticking point. By refusing to swear the Urfede, both men had violated their oaths as burghers to uphold the law. This was stated directly in Kummelmann's case and implied in the documents dealing with Schwarzlein. Now, it would be tempting to view Pankratz Kummelmann and Jakob Schwarzlein as martyrs in the cause of liberty, men fighting against a cruel and unjust system. The truth is rather more complicated. Both men were clearly unpleasant characters, liars, cheats, quarrelsome, and ill-tempered. Moreover, both had been granted every opportunity the law allowed. This is one of those cases where we can't fault the court for not trying. Multiple hearings were held, dozens of witnesses were interviewed, special commissions were convened on at least 4 occasions. The law faculties of 3 universities were brought into the discussion. Kummelmann's ability to appeal to the Reichskammergericht demonstrates that every legal option was explored. And yet, neither Kummelmann nor Schwarzlein were satisfied with the outcomes of their cases. And to some extent, they had a point. The Lemblein family is a common thread tying the two cases together, and their conduct was not above suspicion. The problem is that several of the key players lived in foreign jurisdiction under the rule of the Dukes of Saxe-Coburg. And although both sides submitted petitions, neither the officials in Coburg nor those in Staffelstein could compel anyone on the other side of the border to comply with the rulings. The chapter admitted as much and said the biggest problem in the case was mixed jurisdiction, as it caused endless impediments. This leads to a more general problem of law enforcement in the 17th century. Crime, including violent crime, was endemic. But there wasn't much that could be done about it. The court system and the body of law brought to bear in these cases was relatively new, the product of a thorough reformation of the courts in Bamberg, undertaken between 1490 and 1510. The end product of that reform was a law code, which ultimately became the Carolina, the criminal code for the entire Holy Roman Empire. So this reform was not a minor local event. It had implications for criminal law throughout Germany. Even so, it was new. The system worked reasonably well, but it was stretched to its limits in the attempts to maintain peace and order. There were no police in the 17th century, and most crimes were never solved, even if they were reported. In this regard, the use of torture is instructive. Torture was not used to determine guilt or innocence. Both the law and contemporary jurisprudence insisted that torture could only be applied if there was sufficient evidence of guilt beforehand. The real aim was to find out the names, in the case of thieves, of other thieves, under the assumption that, first of all thieves know one another, and two, that they never work alone. All of the cases where thieves are tortured, that is the primary concern. As far as the executions went, when the thieves themselves were killed, it was meant to send a message to thieves in the district that they should not operate within the 10-mile radius that was under the jurisdiction of the court. And again, that 10 miles appears in some of the verdicts that were handed down by the court. Well, in the same way, Pankraz Kommelmann and Jakob Schwarzlein were punished as examples. There's a whole bunch of cases from their time of local residents who were described simply as insolent, wanton, disrespectful, flippant, and even rebellious. But rarely are the specifics of their crime mentioned. It was the public behavior that mattered in these face-to-face communities, where personal conflicts between families could have repercussions on a regional, if not a national scale. In this sense, these petty lawsuits assumed a significance far beyond the bounds of family. From the bishop's point of view, Kommelmann's stubborn defiance constituted a personal insult against the local officials and the cathedral chapter. Moreover, by appealing his case to the Reichskammergericht, to the Supreme Court, he had besmirched the reputation of his sovereign lord, the bishop, holding up to ridicule before the emperor and his fellow princes. In Schwarzlein's case, the insult took concrete form in the fact that the Duke of Saxe-Coburg had frequently issued letters to the court in Staffelstein objecting to the treatment of his subjects. Kommelmann and Schwarzlein embarrassed their prince in public, insulting he and his officials. That sort of mischief was not lightly overlooked. In his response to the Reichskammergericht, the bishop described Kommelmann's actions as, quote, absolutely contrary to divine and secular law, as well as to the general peace and good Polizei. Now, the last term is noteworthy. Polizei in modern German usually is translated as police. But in the 17th century, it meant something rather different. Polizei means policy in the sense of the overall program of government, and in particular, in the government's role in guaranteeing the general welfare. Without going so far as to say it directly, the Prince Bishop was accusing these two men of treason. Note that the specific act deemed treasonous was exercising their legal, in fact, constitutional rights to file appeals in their cases. Kommelmann and Schwarzlein perpetuated their treason for another 2 decades as the two men persistently rejected injunction after injunction and continued to verbally harass their in-laws, the prison guards, and court officials. Now, their treason, again, did not derive from the commission of a crime or open rebellion in the way we would usually think of treason. It wasn't so much they had broken the law, but that their defiance had unmasked the essential lawlessness of the early modern state. Despite the impressive institutional facade, the courts in Staffelstein, like those in most jurisdictions of the early 17th century, lacked the resources to execute the law in any consistent and uniform manner. And in the absence of consistency and uniformity, vigorous prosecution could easily appear to be arbitrary justice, if not tyranny. Of course, local officials didn't see themselves as tyrannical. They were attempting as best they could to enforce the laws. The magistrates insisted that they were merely executing the decisions of an unpartisan court, but that was part of the problem. People like Kommelmann and Schwarzlein did not want an unpartisan court. They wanted a partisan court. They wanted a court that would respect their status and restore their honor. They were not interested in abstract notions of law, but with thoroughly personal concerns. Recognition of the court's verdict through swearing the urfeide would mean declaring before the world that they had practiced ill on their kith and kin. This would be a stain on their reputation and was unacceptable to them. And here they were not alone. The bishop and chapter both lapsed into the same sort of language of insult and honor. At the root of the conflict, then, lay a cultural gap between two very different conceptions of justice. Sociologists have described situations in which individuals are subject to what are called role conflicts, rooted in the contradictions between different sets of cultural expectations. As burghers and subjects, Kummelmann and Schwarzlein operated within two separate but overlapping spheres, one defined by traditional conceptions of family, honor, status, and another framed in terms of institutional structures of the state, the town, and a body of abstract uniform law. The heart of the contradiction between the two was that while one was intimately rooted in the personal, the private, the other was public and intended to be universal. Such contradictions are endemic in society, and it is always left up to the individual to manage the contradictions as they apply to day-to-day interactions. Ultimately, the process of working out role conflicts helps us to integrate society, helps the individual to operate within a larger social setting. But only if the individual actors are willing to recognize the ultimate necessity of authority and the dominance of certain kinds of norms. Kummelmann and Schwarzlein refused to recognize the standard of justice and obedience required by the state because they viewed submission as a stain on their honor. The state, meanwhile, could not tolerate such insolence and willfulness. The result was an impasse that lasted for more than 2 decades. Here, a final observation. The language of officialdom tended to speak of society as a sacred community, bound together by a common faith with a common purpose. It has been observed that the Reformation and Counter-Reformation constituted one of the most optimistic moments in human history, where the various institutional forces were determined to pool their efforts to ensure that people would become the very best they could be. This optimistic, perhaps even utopian sentiment foundered on the shoals of reality. And as the ideal of a revolutionary transformation of society ebbed, authorities abandoned the goal of perfecting humanity and settled for enforced conformity. One blind spot, and this in some ways gets to the heart of our story, was that the officials, lay and spiritual, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of community. We like to think of community as a group of people who care for one another and share some common vision and common goals. The truth is that community can be based on that, but it can also be based on enmity. The most intense and enduring human relationships are frequently between individuals who hate each other's guts. Enmity was an important part of public life. In a perverse way, it bound people together. And it had a moral side in which, in early 17th century Germany, it would have been considered unethical to pretend to get along with someone that everyone knew that you were in a public dispute with. By refusing to obey and nursing their grievances, even at the price of their own freedom, Jakob Schwarzlein and Pankratz Kummelmann could think of themselves not only as good citizens, but within the social constitution of the early 17th century, perhaps even as patriots. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So much, Professor Smith. All right. Well, kind of blown away by the excellent speakers. There is almost half an hour of time for questions, comments. My husband actually was commenting. He probably will put it in the chat. Something legal. So I am reading. Let's see. Okay, I'm fascinated by the idea of a Narrenhaus Can you speak a bit more about the nature of that institution and how it was operated, I guess? So,
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon in late medieval and early modern Germany. By the way, if any of you ever travel in Germany and you get a chance to go to the town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber, they have a wonderful criminal museum, which, although it's kind of touristy, it has some great stuff in it. One of the things that is a center point of their display is that a big part of discipline in late medieval and early modern Germany involved public humiliation. There were all kinds of devices and techniques. I mean, one that has come down to us in modern days is the drunk tank. Literally, drunks would have to wear a barrel and be marched around town. And a piper, and sometimes a drummer, but always a piper, would accompany them. And so what you would have is these processions led through the town. So for example, if two women were caught fighting in public, they had something that was called a violin, a guise, in which it went around, it was a mobile stocks. It went around their neck and then had their hands in it, and they were both locked in it facing one another. And then, so you can imagine how hard it would be for two people in tandem to walk facing one another locked up in this thing. And there are all kinds of other devices like this. So the Narrenhaus is, I suppose, slightly kinder version of the stocks, because you're inside. Now it's open. It opens out into the public square so people can see you in there. I've only seen one that has survived. Most of these have long since disappeared. They're not very big, and they tend to be, just sort of shoved in a corner somewhere. But it was a fairly common practice, and it's like the pillory in the sense that the whole point of it was to put somebody out there in public view so that they could be humiliated. And in this case, I think it's telling that he was stuck in there, being taken out of the normal prison, because the normal prison was understood as a place of punishment in the way we would think of it, whereas this is a place of humiliation. It was a sign that they viewed him as a fool, not as a criminal, despite 2 decades on and off in jail.
excellent. Let's see. The question comes in, was this a specifically German phenomenon, or did other countries have their own versions of the Narrenhaus? Sorry, I have terrible German pronunciation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's equivalent to the stocks, and I think pretty much everybody used things like that. I don't know if anyone else could comment on whether that specific institution is found in other places. Going once.
Yeah. I have a question. Were there other methods of, obviously they executed every legal recourse, at least Kummelmann did, but are you familiar with the methods of interrogation and other methods, common methods of punishment in this era? Or did they pretty much run the gamut for them?
Well, and this is, again, one of the curious things. These, after all, were civil actions. These weren't criminal cases.
Yes.
They were lawsuits over property. And so the standard procedure in these would be that the two sides would, and we have some of the documentation, which is helpful in this sense. They would interview witnesses, they would take formal depositions. One of the interesting sets, which I didn't talk about, was that the servants were in the house at the time that this old couple died, were brought in and interviewed to see if they remembered what happened, if they had seen the money laying around the house, if they knew who was there. They would also ask for things like wills, receipts. The tax assessor was brought in, and another case, a second person was brought in to do a formal inventory. So they would actually go to the house, they'd go through, they would take inventory of everything, they would get down, and the inventories included not only properties and furnishings, but also debits and credits. This is a society that everything runs on credit. Everybody buys everything on credit. I mean, and so when you look at people's household inventories or their wills, there'll be long columns of debits and credits, you know, money they owe, who owes them money. And in many of these cases, and I suspect this is true in this case, the estates are just totally bound up in debt, both receivable and payable. So the standard procedure, though, in these would have been to gather all the evidence, interview witnesses, and then bring it before court. You would generally have a jury who would listen to the evidence and then make its recommendation. In this, when the question of the severed finger comes up, then it's done according to the criminal law. And in that case, they did torture him, but they said, go light, go easy, you know. And in that case, there were specific grades, and those were not necessarily set into the law. So, you know, they'd start by asking you questions. You'd be confronted by the people who had accused you. You would be asked to make a statement, and then they'd show you the instruments, and then just gradually work their way, thumb screws, shin screws, strappado, the buck, which was basically like a big sawhorse that you'd sit on. Some places used a version of the rack. What it really was is it was a ladder up against the wall, and they tie your hands up at the top and then attach weights to your feet as you're tied to the ladder. But they never seem to have gone that far in this case. But again, the early parts of this, they're civil actions. So there's really no interrogation. It's just getting every single piece of evidence that you can and then piling it in and throwing it in front of the court.
We have a question, and I'm actually going to open this up to Piotr as well. In the absence of a police force specifically, who would be doing investigating, interviewing, and torturing? And I was struck by, I'm going to add to that, I was struck by the incidents of injury causing, you know, mayhem, the loss of the fingers, or the disability in the case of the peasant. How both of that resonates in these stories, and if that is something that comes up in other stories of other histories of this era. So once maybe you can address this, Brad, and then you can address this, Piotr. So,
well, I mean, the thing about cutting off the fingers, that is a sign. You know, when I first read it, I remembered the scene in one of my favorite movies, Captain Blood, when they brand the guy fugitive, you know, traitor. Well, the same thing. If they've cut off the two fingers of your right hand,
he's muted.
Okay, that's weird.
That is strange.
Yeah, having the two fingers cut off, that's a sign that you're an oathbreaker. Everybody knows. The other thing about it was Schwarzlein was a coppersmith. I wonder whether he would have even been able to practice his trade after losing those two fingers. You know, the thing about being tortured in those, and for those people who were tortured, you could see it afterwards. People would be left crippled in the aftermath of these torture sessions. And so, yeah, people would know.
Mm-hmm.
It's, and this is, I think, part of the reason why the two guys were so upset was it's a public insult to be put through all of this.
Piotr is muted. Can we unmute him?
I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Oh, now you're.
That was just me, right?
All right. So.
Well, I just want to join in the wonderful response to the paper. Thank you. This is one of those moments when I realize how much more pleasant the medieval period is than early modernity. I have, at least from my knowledge of the world that I know, no sense of deliberate mutilation, so that there is a little empirical awkward moment. We don't know whether that particular mutilation of the disabled peasant was at all punitive, nor is there much other evidence of anything remotely like that. What I do know in the period and slightly later period too that I study from medieval Poland and Lithuania and nearby are serious transgressions for which compensation tends to be more continuous as a penalty than mutilation or similar punishments. So I cannot think of anything that directly resonates through this particular disability with a punitive side of life. I think my peasant instead demonstrates, I think, how to get oneself out of a punitive aspect of life, whatever that may have been, into order and functional life of some kind, despite that constraint.
I'd just throw something in here real quick, that maybe one of the differences I think between medieval law and the kind of law that I'm dealing with has to do with the reception of Roman law. Nearly all of these kinds of procedures, and particularly the ones involving torture and judicial mutilation, come directly out of Roman law. And so prior to the adoption of Roman law, you don't see this in quite the same way. Once Roman law comes into play, then you start seeing more of this.
Certainly in Poland, that's absolutely right. In Poland, the earliest suggestions that torture is being used in the 14th century do come after the reunification of the kingdom, a completely different political situation than what I'm looking at right now, and that's absolutely accurate. We would look for more severe punishment, but proportionally later in Poland, but earlier than in the period you're studying, since we're back to the dichotomy between the medieval and the early modern. So.
Mm-hmm.
Just to call to you, remind, in the absence of a police force, who would have done these investigations? And then, well, we'll deal with that. The question is, enforcement of civil restraining orders is still problematic. Local law enforcement won't enforce them, often won't enforce domestic restraining orders. Brad, how much of the punishments of these two outlaws was for violation of restraining orders, and how much for contempt of the courts? Oh, how long do we have?
Well, okay. The first thing in terms of who does this, the official from Staffelstein who issues the reports to the chapter, the title that he's given is Kastner, which I guess the modern translation of that would be treasurer. He's sort of the chief financial officer for the district, but his responsibilities go way beyond that. There is a mayor and council, and the court itself that hears these is an emanation of the city council. The Kastner, the treasurer, the chief financial officer, acts as the judge, but not in a kind of modern sense. Now, there is an attorney who is assigned to the case, and he works, the cathedral chapter has its own, essentially equivalent of what we would think of as a district attorney, who then is sent out to conduct the actual investigations. So you have a judge, you've got a jury, you've got essentially a DA. As far as the process of arresting people, that's kind of ad hoc. It's the town watch, whoever they sort of dragoon into doing this. And this is why out in the countryside, nothing happens. I mean, really the only place you can get people is in town, because that's the only place that you can get together enough guys. I've come across a couple of references to trying to put together a posse, but on the whole, it's just, if you're in town, you're likely to get picked up. If you're out in the countryside, no one's going to touch you. As far as restraining order and contempt of court, I don't think they make a distinction here. In a formal sense, yes, one could say that these are restraining orders, but the court consistently views their actions as contempt of court. You are refusing to recognize their authority. And it always goes back to the ortheta. It always goes back to that you swore an oath that you were going to give up your suit. In a sense, they're like NDAs. I would say that's actually the most modern equivalent to this. You swore an oath that you were going to lay off your complaints. You weren't going to bring us back to court anymore. You were going to shut your mouth. You weren't going to defame us, and you violated that. And again, I think it's noteworthy that they only cut off his fingers after he had done this, I think 5 or 6 times. They finally just lost their patience because he would go off and keep saying these things. And yeah, these are hard to enforce. The only enforcement mechanism that they really have is either locking you up or, in that case, chopping off your fingers. And neither case, again, if you have somebody who absolutely refuses to recognize the authority of the court, it doesn't work. So I would add here, by the way, the most common thing to show up in the criminal court records I work with are domestic disputes. So things haven't changed.
I was going to say, how much have things really changed? Max, you had a question. So there we go.
Okay. I'm working at the moment on a set of plays from medieval Italy and France on the life of Antony, or the temptations of Antony. That's Antony of Egypt, not Antony of Padua. In one of the plays it's in Alpine Provençal, a version of Occitan, dated about 1503 from a little community called Nevache in the French Alps. There's a character that Antony meets when he goes into almost his farthest point of his retreat into the woods in terms of ascetic solitude. And the character is called the imperfect man. And he's deformed in some way that's unspecified, okay? And he explains to Antony why he's deformed. It's because he committed this awful sin and he's never confessed it. And it turns out it was the sin of beating his father. And then Antony goes off and visits Paul the hermit. Then he comes back again. And on the way back to his own hermitage, he encounters this imperfect man again. And he's been healed. And he's been healed because he confessed to Antony. Okay? So there is a sense in which the crime can be forgiven and the damage done healed if there is confession. Now, I can see how this works within the theological setting of the medieval Catholic Church. Is there ever any similar movement in the civil courts where a confession, rather than making you, oh, well, now we know you're guilty, we will condemn you, where a confession would lead to lenience?
And is this open to both?
Open to either
yes.
one, yes.
Yes.
What the one such thing I can think of is really common, and I'm not sure that that was involved is a confession, but being able to concede and moving from jurisdiction and the court adjudication altogether into some kind of reconciliation. That is very, 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 very common. It is favored, and it goes back to this excellent earlier question of how do we process these conflicts where there are no police forces or the kinds of institutions that we're familiar with. In this case, it is a way to get past all kinds of imperfections of adjudication. And what it is, again, to make sure I'm clear here, is not confession in any kind of theological sense, but it is, and now that I think about it, I have seen cases of actual admissions. Yes, thank you very much. I'm wrong, or I'm substantially wrong. I'm wrong enough to give up on this. Let's reconcile. of course, then the question is, what drives that behind the scenes? And typically we can't tell, but what we can tell is that that's quite frequent.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. In criminal cases, it depends on the crime. I mean, yeah, in witch trials, for example, if you confess straight up, the same thing happens to you if you didn't. You just save yourself the trouble of being tortured. In one of the robbery cases, that I've looked at, when the robber does confess, he's sentenced to death because hanging is, of course, the standard punishment for thieves. But he is instead exiled. And exile in those days, it really isn't all that bad. It just means you've got to go and live somewhere else, and you can't come back and visit your relatives. But that's a certain amount of leniency. And there was always built into, in criminal things, there was the official verdict, which was and the sentence, which was always very stark. And then there was, in German law, what was called a Gnadenzettel, a certificate of grace that would be granted almost automatically, that would lessen whatever the particular punishment was. So you didn't get the punishment stated in the law. In civil cases, there really is nothing to confess to, I guess. It's just a question of whether you were telling the truth or not. There is a religious side. And David Sabian, in a wonderful book called Power in the Blood, talks about this at some length. Confession was always something that was required of people as part of the sentencing. Once you've been sentenced to the crime, before it's carried out, you're supposed to go through sacramental confession. And one of the things he points out is that a lot of people found this to be an imposition, because if they went in and confessed their sins and received communion, theologically, you had to do that. One of the elements of that, you had to give up whatever your quarrels were. You had to say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And Sabian comes up with all kinds of examples where people say, I can't forgive those who trespassed against me because I still think that they're wrong. And if I take communion with that thought in my heart, I am, as it says in Paul's letters, I am eating and drinking death upon myself.
Ew.
And so the demand for receiving communion could, from the point of view of the people who are being tried, that could be seen as a kind of double jeopardy.
Okay.
You are asking me to put my soul on the line. I still don't accept this judgment. And if I do receive communion, I am potentially ensuring my own damnation by doing this. So there can be, in some cases, a theological dimension to it.
Okay, that's fascinating and very complex. Thank you.
We have a comment in the chat. Currently, plea bargaining, confessing and showing repentance, but yeah, confessing to something can definitely lead to, if not release, then a lessening of the sentence. So there is that. Transformative justice comment. Are there any other questions? Because we are coming close to our time being over. I do want to ask, Piotr, have you been to this village? Have you walked around in the area? I'm just curious.
I have walked around in the area. It is the area is absolutely, except for the monastery itself, the area is absolutely unrecognizable because of where it's situated. Massive depopulation after the Second World War and slight repopulation since. So these are now fairly small village/towns. There is a monument in one of them to the actual Henrico book. The monastery is now restored, very attractive Baroque. Not a mountain in sight. there is a special feel of being there, but it's largely sentimental. In other words, except for some Baroque era artifacts that have been preserved in the monastery fabric, some of which actually refer to the story told in the Henrico book. So yes, it's there, but very far removed from the actual source that I've been using.
Thank you. Lot of thanks. Unless there are unless there are other questions, I'm going to say we begin tomorrow at 9:30 Pacific time, that is, not 9. And we'll have a couple of papers, but proceeding, we will start off again with the screening of the film and a discussion, questions. I have a few things to say about the production and the text itself, what is known. So until tomorrow, then, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of the speakers and all who attended. I so appreciate this. Thank you so much. Lovely to see your faces, or just read your names. And we'll see. I hope more you again tomorrow. Be well.